Before I dive into this review, I want to dedicate it to Mickey Portnoy, the bestest buddy in all of metal. Unfortunately, Mickey left us earlier this year, and it broke my little heart. So yeah, this one's going out to you, Mickey. In the arms of this one's for you, Mickey! But luckily now we have Maisie Daisy. So the hole will never be filled, but Maisie's a nice little, fluff ball. So with that all being covered, let's dive into this actual album. Parasomnia by Dream Theater. So, Dream Theater is back. I don't think they need too much of an introduction. The legends, the myth, the grandfathers at this point of progressive metal, getting their start in the mid to late 80s, putting out When Dream and Day Unite in 1989, getting stardom and fame with their Images and Words in 92. And I feel like Images and Words was the one that kind of catapulted them into the general zeitgeist, like the public's eye. I feel like Pull Me Under did numbers back in the day, and this is what really started the progressive metal landscape. You had Queensryche, you had Rush, you had, Iron Maiden and Metallica, and they were all doing variations of prog metal, some more than others, but I feel like Dream Theater was the one that really put the nail in the coffin and said, this is progressive metal, not just metal that does progressive tendencies. This is full-on progressive metal. And throughout their career, they kind of maintained that flag and put that first and foremost. It was progressive metal. The band has gone through member change-ups. You had keyboardists come and go. The most notable one now for Parasomnia is Mike Portnoy being back on the drums. Mike Portnoy was one of the founders of the band. It was him and the two Johns that really were the heart and soul of Dream Theater. And when he left after Black Clouds and Silver Linings, I always felt like the albums that came afterwards were still good, but it was missing the heart. I always said that if, James LeBray was the soul and, Petrucci was the brains, it really was Portnoy as the drum, as the heart. And I feel like we lost that heart. We lost that direction within the music. And again, not to say that Dramatic Turn of Events, The Astonishing, Distance Over Time, and A View from the Top of the World are bad. They're still pretty good records, but, there was just something missing. So, coming into it, we have Mike Portnoy back on the drums, and I think that's why a lot of people are coming back to this record and excited for this record, because, Distance Over Time and Views were just fine. They were just fine. We've got the 16th studio record from the group. So let's talk about first what's on everybody's mind, right? Is it good? Are the boys back? Is Portnoy bringing the juice? And I can pretty much confirm that yes, indeed, the boys are back, the juice is back, and I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the best record that they've done. I wouldn't say that this would be, in the top 5, but what it does have is it has that direction, it has that identity that a lot of the Dream Theater records post-Portnoy lacked, and I think that's what Portnoy brings to these projects. Each of the records prior to this, like prior to Dramatic Turn of Events, they all had their own identity. They all had their own essence about it that made that album special. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but a track from, say, Falling Into Infinity wouldn't necessarily work on, say, A Train of Thought. A track from Awake wouldn't necessarily work with Systematic Chaos. Each of those tracks felt at home on the album that they found themselves on. Now, the same couldn't necessarily be said for Distance Over Time, View from the Top of the World, and A Dramatic Turn of Events. And even to a certain extent, The Astonishing, but Astonishing is kind of its own beast off into its own. Parasomnia, all of the tracks on here feel unified. They all feel like they have the same identity. They all feel like they're cut from the same cloth, and not just because they're Dream Theater. It feels like it's got its own idea and its own essence. The other thing that I really love about this record is the overall concept of this record. Parasomnia being kind of the state, I believe, within dreaming, within being awake, where, it's not quite insomnia. It's not quite having like sleep paralysis. It's like this separate thing where it's hard to kind of distinguish what's dream and what's not. And like, it's all to do with dreaming, with reality, and kind of like the veil between the two. And all of the tracks have a little bit of that essence, like baked within it, whether you're talking about a sleep paralysis demon or this, mythical monster within the final track, whether you're talking about sleepwalkers that commit murder, but not being in the right headspace or even know what they're doing, and whether it's literally like not knowing, what's real and what's not. And I like the fact that even though this wouldn't necessarily be a quote unquote concept record, at least the record has a very clear vision and a very clear focus. So love the fact that right out of the gate, we have some direction, we have some tightness, and, it all feels unified in this sense. Now, I want to touch upon some of the, I wouldn't necessarily even say negatives or criticisms, but some things that I've kind of kept in my mind about this. And it is a little bit stark, it is a little bit, if you're a fan of Dream Theater like myself, and you can be critical of the band, a lot of it is that they are drawing from the same well quite regularly. And I'm not even saying that's a necessarily bad thing, but it is something that I've realized. Take, for instance, the track A Broken Man. I believe this is one of the few tracks that James LeBray penned the lyrics for. But this is a track that feels very similar to tracks that we've had before. They're talking about war. They're talking about being affected by wars and how that, the PTSD of it all. But we've already had that in 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. We already had that within Prophets of War. And we already had that with one of the tracks from Distance Over Time. I don't think it's the Alien, and I don't think it's, one of those, but it's one of those, right? And so it's like we've already covered the lyrical content of this style, and we've also covered, big scary monsters that we had with the Shadow Man incident. Dark Eternal Night basically covers the same thing of this big, massive creature that goes and rampages through it. But I also feel like we're covering the same kind of like scary thoughts, but everything being okay in the end. Ish, like if we're taking one of my favorite tracks off of this album, which is Dead Asleep, which it tells this story, this narrative of a gentleman who essentially murders his wife, but doesn't realize what he's doing because he was sleepwalking the entire time. And then he gets off scot-free, and apparently it's based off of a true story. But like we've already kind of had something was scary, but it actually turned out kind of okay in the end with A Nightmare to Remember. And I almost wanted to like play out more of the consequences and like stay with this character after the fact, in the same way that the car crash of A Nightmare to Remember talks about the incident, but not the fallout. And that's what I wanted to see, kind of structuring the narrative of this track more with how this guy deals with knowing that he murdered his wife, but not being in the right mind. Like, is he afraid to go to sleep now? Does he even want to have another partner? Like, is he afraid this will happen again? Because I feel that's a little bit more compelling than just being a Cole's notes of what happened. Let's talk about the music. The music overall is quite enjoyable, and it's got the usual MOs of Dream Theater, and everybody on here feels like they're playing very well together, and they're really meshing well. These guys have been playing together now for a very long time, so I would be kind of remiss if they were starting to falter a little bit. James LeBray, his vocals are strong on this one. He's definitely not touching the same ways that he was with Awake or Images and Words, but I can feel like he's never straining. I feel like he's playing very well within his sandbox. And talking about the vocals, hearing some of the harmonizations with Portnoy back on the kind of harmonizing side of things, it provides a much fuller dynamic within the singing styles that I really, really appreciate. These are some of the singing styles that I loved from Systematic Chaos, where they were really playing with harmonizing and creating a soundscape within the vocals. Not having LeBray kind of be just on the stage by himself trying his best to hold on. He's got help from his fellow bandmates to help really provide the spotlight for him and lift him up. The noodling that we have from Jordan Rudess on the keyboards and John Petrucci on the lead guitars, they're fantastic. They're great. I really enjoy the big play out of Bend the Clock, which is the 7th track, the ballady track. It really showcases Petrucci's ability not only to shred the threat like he's able to do, but also just to kind of take a moment and just hold and sustain those notes. I do wish that Bend the Clock was a little bit I wish that it didn't end on a play out. I really wish that they had that really finite ending piece, like it really came together. And maybe if they pushed it more into like, I don't know, an 8-minute rather than it just being 7.5 minutes. But, the runtime itself was already kind of where it's at. I really enjoyed also how dark this album feels. Like this feels like it was kind of a crossroads between Train of Thought and Dark Clouds and Silver Linings. I feel like this is actually a very good kind of successor of Black Clouds, more so than a dramatic turn of events, because it's got that same kind of flow and kind of got that same kind of essence. I mean, overall, this album doesn't necessarily have a bad track. If I were being perfectly honest, I think A Broken Man was probably the weaker of the tracks that we've gotten so far. I love how this album opens up with the 1-2 punch of In the Arms of Morpheus, which is basically just an overture. We're presented with a number of themes that will be reprised throughout the album's runtime, which I absolutely love. I also love how the Shadow Man incident, the big epic at the end, the main theme of that is kind of in the little interlude between tracks, kind of showing that this big shadow creature has kind of always been with us throughout the runtime of this record. And I like how they're kind of constructing that. But I digress. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So the 1-2 punch of In the Arms of Morpheus and Night Terror does a great way of opening up this album. I almost wish that these two tracks were kind of combined into one to make about, 15, 16 minutes worth of music, the same way that Black Clouds and Silver Linings opened up with The Nightmare to Remember. Broken Man, I've already talked about. Dead Asleep, I already talked about. I really love how Dead Asleep has a number of ebbs and flows within it. It has this really nice bounce to it that I really enjoy. Midnight Messiah is where things really pick up, and Midnight Messiah might be my favorite smaller track off of this record. I love how punchy it is. I love how aggressive it is. That's where I'm getting that kind of train of thought aspect of it. Are We Dreaming is just a little interlude. I already talked about Bend the Clock, which is the really beautiful ballady piece on here. Then we come to the 19-minute The Shadow Man incident. I want to spend just the last little bit of this review talking about that, because I really enjoyed how they're able to construct this big epic. I will admit, when I first listened to this epic, I was a little disappointed. This was the big epic, and I was expecting, I don't even know what I was expecting. I was trying to tamper my thoughts. I'm like, this isn't In the Presence of Enemies. This isn't Octavarium. This isn't Change the Seasons. I have to remember that this is, later Dream Theater. So I want to temper my expectations. But what I really particularly love is that they're able to construct these memorable passages. The big epic that was on A View from the Top of the World, I think it's the title track. I don't remember it at all. Even the Illumination Theory, I think, from the self-titled album, I barely remember. The only thing I remember is that it was a Count of Tuscany ripoff. But this one, at least, I don't know. I think I was waiting for that big, meaty crescendo. I was waiting for that big Octavarium oomph. I was waiting for that big 6 degrees oomph. And even though we don't necessarily get it on the first handful of listens, the more I listen to it, the more I'm loving it, and the more that I really appreciate that big note sequence that we get at the end, the big theme being reprised. So it took a while, but I'm starting to really grow on me, and I'm really enjoying it. So in the end, wrapping this whole thing up, here's what I'll say. This isn't necessarily the best Dream Theater record we've ever gotten. It's, a little bit of an arm's length from that. It's definitely not A Scenes from the Memory. It's definitely not 6 Degrees. It's not Images and Words. It's not Octavarium. But what it is it has its own unique identity within the discography of Dream Theater. It's an album that I have become, not necessarily addicted to, but, I feel drawn towards it. I'm always looking forward to the next spin. I'm always excited to listen to it one more time. And I couldn't really say that about any post-Portnoy album outside of maybe A Dramatic Turn of Events. All those other albums, I felt like it was more of an obligation just because I'm a Dream Theater fan first. This one's the first one that, once the Shadow Man incident is over, I immediately want to go back and start over In the Arms of Morpheus. That goes to show how great this album is. Yeah, I think my overall rating for this album will be Parasomnia by Dream Theater is one I would absolutely pick up in physical format. It's a great time. I think it's a great time to be a Dream Theater fan. As I mentioned, it's not necessarily their best, but man, this is an enjoyable listen and one that I actively look forward to every single time I sit down and listen to it. In fact, right after this review, I'm going to go back and listen to it again because yes, it is that good. I've seen a lot of reviews of this record as, you know, it's one of the best, it's the greatest, and I love that people are connecting with it that much, but I do want to temper expectations to remind people this isn't their best work, but it's still a very, very good time. So that's what I've got for Parasomnia by Dream Theater. What do you guys think about this record? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. If you haven't already and you want to see more of me, go and check out my Patreon. I've left the link down below, or become a member of the YouTubes. I do a lot of these videos in batches, so if you want to see videos early, do so. You can do that on my YouTube channel, or if you want to get some exclusive content that I'm going to be putting out specifically for the Patreon, I'm going to have a chat with one of my good friends about this album. So if you want to see us dive deep into this record, I'll be putting up this video kind of at the end of the month for non-members and non-subscribers. But if you want to listen to it almost immediately, I'll be putting that out early next week. Go subscribe onto my Patreon or go become a member here. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.